Has anybody seen, I'm told that there is, but I haven't seen it, a video in the video stores of the sightings program that you can rent or buy or in Blockbusters? And there are 2 of them? No, sightings you've seen in Blockbusters? It's supposed to be a composite of a couple of programs. Somebody told me that they saw me in it, and I don't know when it was or what it was, and I always like to be prepared when somebody says, you said that, when in fact that isn't what I said. You know, that's par for the course, but you need to know where to go to find out. Was there any noise down here about the British Airways sighting of January 1995 that got mentioned last month? 2 pilots in a plane ready to land in Manchester, England, and a wedge-shaped object went by. The co-pilot thought it was so close he ducked. And they did a year-long investigation in England. It was considered a near miss, which pilots are supposed to report nighttime. And the pilots were congratulated for reporting it, and they couldn't find an explanation for it. It made the front pages in a Toronto paper, which has never before published anything reasonable about UFOs, so I thought maybe it made it big down here, but apparently not. Are we ready? You need more light? I'll tell somebody to push a... Can you read that?
Yeah, that's fine. Hi, good evening. Welcome to a Speakers Forum sponsored event, as well as WPI's Pugwash Society. We scheduled this event to correspond with the 70th anniversary of Robert Goddard's rocket launch in Worcester, Mass. The reason why we did that is because there was a great deal of controversy about Robert Goddard's research. And in fact, the New York Times was quoted as saying, "He only seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools," the Times wrote, speaking about his rocket research. Essentially, they were calling him foolish for his ideas and for his ability to put together the theories that he did. And this continually happens in science when there's new research that comes up. Such is the case with UFO research as well. There's a lot of controversy and a lot of skepticism. So with that being the case, we thought it would be most appropriate. And the speaker we have here tonight is a very appropriate choice to start off a lecture series because he has a very strong background in science and is very aware of what it takes to prove a theory or to at least distinguish facts from fiction. StantonFriedman is a nuclear physicist. He received BS and MS degree in physics from the University of Chicago in 1955 and 1956. He has 3 distinct careers since. For 14 years, he worked on the development of a wide variety of highly classified, very advanced nuclear space systems development programs for such companies as General Electric, Westinghouse, General Motors, and Aerojet General. These included nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and compact reactors for space applications. From 1970 to 1982, he lectured about and researched UFOs full-time. Since 1982, he has combined lecturing, industrial consulting, and various research and communication activities. Overall, Mr. Friedman has spoken at more than 600 colleges and to more than 100 professional groups in all 50 United States and in 9 of the 10 Canadian provinces, as well as in Italy, England, Finland, and Germany. He has appeared on hundreds of radio and TV shows across North America, including Nightline, Larry King, Unsolved Mysteries, Sally Jesse Raphael, Dennis Prager, Canada AM, Sightings, and Encounters, as well as many more. He has published more than 70 articles about UFOs, was the first and is still an ongoing researcher on the Roswell incident, co-authored the definitive Roswell book, Crash at Corona, now in its 5th printing, and has been heavily involved in several documentary movies, as well as the 1995 interactive CD-ROM, UFOs, The Real Story. He is working on 2 more books at his Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada office. The title of Mr. Friedman's presentation is Flying Saucers Are Real. His talk will be followed by a question and answer session. Copies of a free book list and of various other publications are for sale at the back of the hall. So, at the front, excuse me. So let us please welcome Stanton Friedman.
Thanks for coming out tonight. I know that there are things on... Is this thing on? Yeah, okay. I know that there are things that are on television that might be interesting, so I appreciate your taking your time here instead. You hope I get finished in time so you can watch the interesting stuff. I know. I have an impossible job in some ways. There's no way to tell you everything you always wanted to know about flying saucers in 1 lecture or 10 lectures. There's a huge amount of good, solid information out there. There's also, unfortunately, an awful lot of garbage, and the problem is how to separate the two. What I can do tonight is to sort of take you by the hand and lead you past the evidence that has led me to the 4 major conclusions I've reached after 38 years of study and investigation. I'll give those right up front. First, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline the some 18 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not, and I don't care about those. 2, the subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate, meaning that some few people within the government of the United States and Canada and undoubtedly many other countries have known since July 1947, when 2 crashed flying saucers with alien bodies were recovered in New Mexico by the government, that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. 3, none of the objections to the first 2 conclusions by a small group of debunkers, noisy negativists, call them what you will, people like my University of Chicago classmate for 3 years, Carl Sagan, stand up under careful scrutiny. Their arguments sound great until you look at the evidence and they collapse of their own weight. And finally, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft and successful cover-up of the best data, the bodies and the wreckage, obviously, for almost 50 years. You can see I'm a shy and retiring kind of guy. A definition up front to set the tone, and to prove that I'm a physicist, you got to start with the definition. All UFO sightings can be put in one of 3 categories, and it's important to distinguish amongst these 3 groups in our discussion tonight. First, UFOs converted to IFOs, identifiable flying objects. This is the majority of the cases, but once a sighting is identified, it is of no further use in the search for truth about truly unidentifiable flying objects. So scratch category 1. Category 2 must also be dismissed because it includes only those reports for which there is insufficient information on which to base a conclusion as to what was observed. Not enough data? Throw those out too, not much you can do with them. That leaves us only with the sightings in category 3 as a database for a serious effort to figure out what gives with flying saucers. And maybe I better stress, I'm talking about flying saucers. All flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. Just to make that little distinction. The 3rd category, those reports of strange phenomena in the sky or on the ground which the observer cannot identify, which remain unidentified after investigation by competent investigators, which furthermore we judge to be manufactured objects based on the way they look, and we deduce to have been manufactured elsewhere than on Earth based on the way they behave. Now that's a lot of kickers on that last definition, and the skeptic at this point, and in an audience this size, I expect there's at least 3 skeptics. You can always find 3, I mean. The skeptic would say, hey, with that last definition, he just killed the rest of his lecture, because we all know, since we hear it so often from those debunkers, that There aren't any good sightings that can't be identified by competent investigators, and certainly no indication that we're dealing with extraterrestrial spacecraft. Right? Wrong. Totally false. Definitely untrue. Completely incorrect. I'm sure you get the point. A major point I'd like to make tonight is that every large-scale scientific study of flying saucers, and I'll talk about 5 of them, has produced a substantial number of Category 3 reports. The problem isn't that there isn't enough evidence to substantiate my conclusions. The problem is that most people are totally unaware of that evidence, especially the media people and the debunkers. So, believe it or not, I want to spend the first part of my lecture dealing with evidence. I know you're not supposed to do that anymore. You're supposed to express an opinion, and the heck with the evidence, but I'm old-fashioned. We'll do it that way. Now, the largest official, comprehensive, scientific, government-sponsored study of flying saucers ever done was completed, believe it or not, way back in 1955. The study was done by the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, a very well-respected research and development firm, under contract to the old Project Blue Book, which we now know was one of many government projects concerned with UFOs. For many years, it was thought to be the only one. Blue Book, it was in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. And it was Battelle's job to go through all the sightings in the Blue Book files for the period, say, 1948 through 1953. More than 3,200 sightings were investigated. Every single one was categorized as something or other. Aircraft, balloon, astronomical, my categories. Every single one was evaluated as to quality. And they put together a huge report, Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. 3,200 sightings, 240-some charts, tables, graphs, maps. I was in data heaven when I first saw it. Now, the report itself has never been publicly distributed by the government, even though a privately published version is available. Instead, in October 1955, the Air Force distributed a 3-part package. A press release, from which I'll quote in a minute, a supposed summary of the report, which somehow includes no data from all those charts, tables, graphs, and maps. How they could call it a summary, I don't know, but they did and got away with it. And finally, an official Air Force drawing of sort of a comic book flying saucer. And the thrust of the package was, we just finished this huge study of flying saucers. They didn't say who did it or where, or even give the title. If they'd sent Blue Book Special Report 14, surely some reporter would have said, what do you mean 14? What happened to 1 through 13? We'd never heard about them. The answer would have to have been they were all classified, so of course they didn't give that title. They said, we've just finished this huge report. There's nothing of flying saucers, but soon we'll be building things that look like this drawing. And if you see one, don't worry about it. It's ours. Let's turn the projector on. These are those 4 conclusions, just for those of you who like to see things spelled out in detail. I don't even know if you can read them from back there, but you get the gist of them. Now, there's the drawing I was talking about, and that thing did get built. It was a Canadian-American Avro car. It did fly 3 feet off the ground, but it flew. And the project was canceled, supposedly. Instead, we now know it was moved down to the States and continued for another 6 years, but that's another story. In the press release, the Secretary of the Air Force said, quote, on the basis of this report, we believe that no objects, such as those popularly described as flying saucers, have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available, unquote. That seems very straightforward. 2 facts. The percentage of unknowns was only 3%. The only reason those sightings couldn't be explained is that there wasn't enough data. By my definition, those were Category 2 reports. There are no Category 3 reports, and we can forget all this nonsense about flying saucers. Similar statements have been made hundreds of times since. There's only one thing wrong with the 2 factual statements by the Secretary of the Air Force. They are both totally and completely false. Here's the categorization of the 3,200 sightings. Psychological really means psychological aberrations, a polite way of saying crackpot cases. Notice it's 1.5%. Now, the American Physical Society, to which I and most physicists belong, says 2% of the papers submitted to it are crackpot papers. That means there are more crackpots associated with physics than with flying saucers. I'm one of the few with the foot in each camp, you understand. But, all right, the category we're interested in, category 3, that's the unknowns. You notice the percentage of unknowns was 3%? Forget it, 21.5%. Obviously, the Secretary of the Air Force wasn't too sharp at arithmetic. Equally obvious, he wasn't very observant, or he would have noted, as all of you have by now, the next to the last category there called insufficient information. They go out of their way to stress if vital information was missing about a sighting, it absolutely could not be listed as an unknown. Instead, and appropriately, it was listed as insufficient information. Clearly, he was wrong on both counts. Now, the skeptic at this point would say, hey, those are interesting numbers, but you snuck in there before they did a quality evaluation of all those sightings. How do we know that those unknowns aren't the 2-second observations at 3 in the morning by the town drunks of the world? Perfectly legitimate question. This is how we know. This is the quality distribution of the same 3,201 sightings. These are all percentages, incidentally. Of the best cases, of the excellent ones, 35% only, I'm sorry, I've got to use the Air Force terminology, only 35% couldn't be explained. Of the good cases, only 26%, the doubtful and poor, fewer than 20%. Now, how many good cases would it take to prove the reality of flying saucers? 1. In the middle of a Super Bowl game, for example, if a craft landed and so forth and so on. Now, the simple fact, in other words, is the better the quality of the sighting because of the background of the observer, the duration of observation, the circumstances, the more likely to be listed as an unknown, exactly the opposite of what the skeptics try to tell us, and precisely what you'd expect if the unknowns were really something different. But you see, that raises the $64 billion question. If the unknowns weren't aircraft, they weren't balloons, they weren't astronomical, they weren't miscellaneous, they weren't the ones for which there wasn't enough information, just what out of this world were they? You say, wait a minute, how'd you get out of this world from just a bunch of numbers? Well, I didn't. I've never been, to the best of my knowledge, out of this world. It's really a combination of two things taken together that leads us to the conclusion that the unknowns, that's what we're talking about now, strictly unknowns, are from out of this world. The appearance coupled with the behavior of the unknowns. What do they look like? Well, typically we're dealing with apparently round, symmetric, seemingly metallic, disc-shaped objects, definite size, shape, surface texture, things sticking out that might be landing gear, might be antenna, might be decorations. Those are interpretations. Typically, but not always, bigger in diameter than thickness, size ranging from, maybe 10 feet in diameter up to 150 feet in diameter. A much smaller number of unknowns that were huge cigar-shaped so-called motherships into which were often observed flying the smaller disc-shaped objects. What do I mean by huge? Well, I had one airline pilot tell me of a case that he was involved in. They watched it on radar. It was 5 or 6 times the size of a 747, he said. Had another case, pilot described something flying around his 747 that was twice the size of an aircraft carrier. That's what I mean by huge. That's pretty good size to be flying around. Now, with just a physical description, there is, of course, no basis at all for saying these things are of extraterrestrial origin, because a whole bunch of companies here that could build things that look as I described. You know, Boeing and Lockheed and Airbus and several others. You put up enough money, allow plenty for overruns, and they'll build as many as you want. It's only when we add into the picture the behavior of these objects that we say, hey, they weren't built here, because these round, metallic, disc-shaped objects, typically flying without any wings, without any tail, without any blinking red and green lights, without any noise, often with a glow around them, not around the observer, but around the object. These objects were able to sit still in the sky Move straight up, straight down, move forward and then back. Move at thousands of miles an hour horizontally. Make right-angled turns at speeds like 2,200 miles an hour as observed on radar. Now you put that combination together, the ability to go up, down, back, forth, silent, extraordinarily high-speed maneuverability without any of the normal things we associate with aircraft. Remember, we're talking back in the 40s and 50s. And you say it wasn't built here on planet Earth because to any government, what's important about a flying saucer is the technology. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. They can fly circles around anything we got flying. If we could build things that looked and acted as I described back in the 50s, we Earthlings, I'm making a presumption at the moment anyway, we Earthlings would no longer be building F-16s, 17s, 18s, MiG-29s, Mirage 5s. We are still building those aircraft. Therefore, what was built back then wasn't built here on Earth. And if it wasn't built on Earth, it was built someplace else. That doesn't answer any of the question, why are they here? Why don't they land on a White House lawn, et cetera, et cetera. It just says not made on planet Earth, and I find that very exciting. Where do I think they're from? From another solar system in our local galactic neighborhood. Now, if there's one concept you will be tested on at the end of this program, local neighborhood. I am so sick and tired of people saying, well, how could they get here from another galaxy? I don't know, and I don't care. Let's talk about the local neighborhood. Within 54 light years of here, the galaxy is about 80,000 light years across, so you can see what I mean, just down the street, round the corner. Within 54 light years of here, there are 1,000 stars, of which 46 are similar to the sun and might be expected to have planets and life. That's as far as I want to worry about within 54 light years. That's our local neighborhood. I'll name a specific place a little bit later. 2 places, actually. All right, back to this report. The guys who did this, careful, competent, conservative professionals, spending full time, had tight rules. For example, no sighting could be listed as an unknown unless all 4 of the final report evaluators agreed it was an unknown, but it could be listed as anything else with 2 votes. They asked the obvious question, is there any difference between the unknowns and the knowns? Maybe we just missed the boat in this screening process. Let's do a statistical cross comparison. For any of the mathematicians out there, they did a chi-square analysis, unknowns versus knowns, on the basis of 6 different observables. Apparent size, color, shape, speed, that sort of thing. The probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. Less than 1%. Now that doesn't prove they're different. It says it's very unlikely the unknowns are just misknowns because the 2 groups don't match in any characteristic which was checked. And a key feature, maneuverability, wasn't even considered. Let's get rid of another myth, duration of observation. The myth being UFO sightings don't last very long, just a few seconds, like automobile accidents, can't trust eyewitness testimony. Poppycock, plain and simple. The average unknown was observed for considerably longer than the average known. More than 60% of the unknowns were observed for longer than 60 seconds. More than 30% were observed for longer than 5 minutes. And more than 10% were observed for longer than 30 minutes. We are simply not dealing, here at least, with short-term observations by incompetent observers seeing things under poor circumstances. Are there cases like that? Of course there are. There are also midgets in the world, but the basketball coach says, I don't care about the midgets, give me the 7-footers. I don't care about the lousy cases, give me the good ones, we got plenty of those. All right, now this is the oldest, the largest, one of the ones we've been lied to the most about studies of flying saucers ever done. How many people here have read a copy of Project Blue Book, Special Report 14? Just raise your hand. Say yes if you have. Boy, I struck out on that one, didn't I? Okay. We'll run through several other sources much more quickly. The UFO evidence on the left, it's being revised, incidentally. It's about time, almost 30 years ago, this one came out. information on 746 unknowns sifted out from about 4,500 cases investigated by the mostly professional members of the old National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. At one point had 14,000 members. Anyway, there are entire chapters on sightings by military pilots, by commercial pilots, by law enforcement officers, by engineers, scientists, astronomers. An excellent chapter on evidence for intelligent control of some UFOs. Privately published, most people don't even know that it exists. Another one nobody's ever heard of, Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, hearings before the Committee on Science and Astronautics, House of Representatives, Congress in other words, July 29th, 1968, my birthday. 6 scientists testified in person, 6 more of us in writing only. I was one of the latter group of 6. The total testimony was included in this 247-page report, available only from the government and not mentioned in a list of government reports about UFOs that you can get from the Air Force, undoubtedly because it was by far the best. Now, the 12 scientists cover a broad spectrum of professional backgrounds: nuclear physics, astrophysics, astronomy, psychology, sociology, biology, gravitational physics, civil engineering, respectable institutions, Harvard, Berkeley, Stanford, Westinghouse, General Dynamics, that sort of place. The best paper in here, in my opinion, was one by the late Dr. James E. McDonald, a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. Originally a skeptic, as I was too, until I looked at the evidence. He was challenged. He visited NICAP, the people who did this study here, visited Project Blue Book in Ohio, and wound up spending almost full time for almost 3 years investigating UFO sightings. Jim personally interviewed over 500 witnesses. And these were almost all pre-screened cases, so he spent his time on the unknowns rather than on the knowns, which is the way to do it if you can manage. To make a very long story short, he concluded this is the most challenging scientific problem of our time, that some UFOs are of extraterrestrial origin, and that the Air Force Project Blue Book effort was completely inadequate from a scientific viewpoint. He went on to present information on more than 40 cases that couldn't be identified, subdivided into 6 groups, each group dealing with the typical objections of the noisy negativist. You've heard them all. How come they're never seen on radar? Gives you a bunch of radar cases. Why aren't they ever seen over big cities? Gives you a bunch of big city cases. Well, how come there's always only one witness, and that witness a kook, where you define kook as somebody who claims to have witnessed a UFO, of course. He gives you a bunch of multiple witness cases. 10, 20, 50 witnesses? Well, how come they're never seen by the professionals who watch the sky? The astronomers, the pilots, the meteorologists. Gives you a bunch of sightings by each of those groups. So you can raise any of those objections you wish. But please don't reach a conclusion until you've studied the data, because none of those, nor any others I've been able to find in 38 years of looking, stand up under careful scrutiny. I consider Jim's paper, and I have a few copies of it here, the single best paper ever published on the subject. 70 pages long, loads of data. For those of you who think there's only tabloid stuff, not so. How many people have read the UFO evidence? Raise your hand if you have. 1. 2. Wow. How many have read the congressional hearings document? 1, 2, different 2. Half of a different 2. Okay. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was the Air Force scientific consultant on UFOs for 20 years. He's an astronomer, the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Best known, I suppose, for 2 things. Back in the 60s, there was a fuss up in Michigan about some cases where he said what was observed might have been swamp gas. And boy, did the cartoonists go for that one. Allen collected a lot of the cartoons. He had a good sense of humor, and he was also involved in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The title comes from a chapter in this book. In the book, Allen made quite clear that he did not believe that UFOs can be swept under the swamp gas rug, or any other rug for that matter. He presented information on more than 70 sightings that couldn't be explained, including Close Encounters of the First, Second, and Third Kind. Had some recommendations about what can be done, what should be done, what was wrong with Blue Book, and some strong comments about the inadequacy of the University of Colorado study, the infamous and mistitled Condon Report. Mistitled because it's not scientific and it's about IFOs, not UFOs. 965 pages, though. It is long. This was the study, usually referred to as the Condon Report, because the director was the late Dr. Edward Condon, world-famous physicist at the University of Colorado, spent $500,000. When the study was completed, when the report came out, headlines all over the world. Scientific study shows no UFOs, no benefit to science from study of UFOs. UFOs nonsense, scientists shows. Those were the good ones. There were some nasty ones, some nasty editorials, including my least favorite, I guess, from a California paper which said now the UFO nuts can join that other crazy group, the Flat Earth Society, and let the rest of us do something useful. Now, all that nonsense, and that's what it was based on Condon's summary and conclusions, the first 2 chapters, and from my contacts with him, I honestly believe he didn't read the rest of the report, and an Air Force press release. And just as was the case with Blue Book Special Report 14, what the public was told and what the document shows are exactly the opposite. The data of the report make an excellent case for some UFOs as extraterrestrial spacecraft. Not that you'd know it from the summary and conclusions. Now, I don't want to nitpick. It would take me at least 30 minutes to do it the dishonor it deserves, but let me give you the findings of a special UFO subcommittee established by the world's largest group of space scientists, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the AIAA. They set up an 11-man subcommittee, people from government, from university, from industry, and it was sexist. There weren't any women on the committee. There also were none of us UFO nuts on the committee. I'm an AIAA member, but they wouldn't have me on the committee because I was biased because I'd reached a conclusion. 11 years of study and I shouldn't reach a conclusion? I always thought the worst bias was ignorance. But anyway, they spent 3 years looking at lots of data, including this report. They very quietly published their findings in an obscure technical journal. No headlines, no editorials. They noted that careful study of this report reveals that 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified. Furthermore, they said that one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Condon's based on the data in the report, and that any phenomena with 30% unknown is certainly worthy of further investigation. There have been 3 different sessions at international meetings of the AIA at which papers were presented by professionals dealing with flying saucers. How many people have read Dr. Condon's book? Say yes if you had. Oh, at least 3 out there. Hey, we're getting there. How many have read Dr. Hynek's book? Say yes. Oh, at least 5. It's usually 2 to 1, Hynek over Condon. There's a reason for asking you the question. I'm not going to tell you what it is right now, but we'll get there. Now, the obvious question, rhetorical, how come, with all these mountains of data, the big shots of science and journalism haven't jumped on the pro-UFO bandwagon? Well, I'm going to give you 4 reasons. I should point out, one reason is that 11 anti-UFO books that have been published, not one mentioned Blue Book Special Report 14, even though all the authors were well aware of it. The Condon Report doesn't mention it, even though it's got a large chapter on government involvement in UFO investigations. Standard rule for debunkers: what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. There are 3 other rules in case you're interested. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's a lot easier. Don't bother with doing research by investigation. Do it by proclamation. Nobody will know the difference anyway. That's the debunkers. We'll come back to them. Now, before getting into the 4 reasons the big shots haven't jumped on the bandwagon, I do want to get rid of another myth, namely that most people don't believe in UFOs. What makes me think they do? The facts. Here's 4 Gallup polls. I didn't make up the questions. I had nothing to do with these. You think they're real? Do you think they're imaginary? Or you're not sure what you think? These are all percentages. Way back 30 years ago, the ratio of believers to non-believers was only 1.5 to 1. By 1973, after we'd been to the moon 5 times, it was 1.8 to 1. By 1978, it was better than 2 to 1, 57 to 27. Now, the noisy negativists were so successful that by 87, it was only 1.6 to 1, 49 to 30. Now, the debunkers have an explanation. It's a testable hypothesis. They say, look, the reason so many people believe in flying saucers is all that tabloid nonsense. Tabloids in the supermarket, tabloids on programs on television. Testable hypothesis. If that were true, one might reasonably expect that the greater the education, the less likely to believe in flying saucers. Because presumably the greater the education, the less likely to be influenced by the tabloids. And if that isn't true, we're all in trouble. Well, here's the data. These are adults with a grade school education, high school education, and a college background. With only a grade school education, indeed, the non-believers slightly outnumber the believers, 38 to 36%. With a high school diploma, the ratio of good guys to bad guys is better than 2 to 1, 57 to 27. But the real shocker is with a college background, it's 66 to 23, almost 3 to 1, believers over non-believers. Simple fact, the greater the education, the more likely to believe in flying saucers. Exactly the opposite of what the debunkers always try to tell you. And naturally, as you'd expect, if you were to poll engineers and scientists involved in research and development activities, and it's been done twice, the ratio of believers to non-believers, 1.5 to 1. Now, the most recent result that's relevant here, last October I was in England, do 7 lectures plus a debate at the Historical Oxford Debate Society, formed in 1823. The topic for the night, this house believes that intelligent alien life has visited planet Earth. I anchored the affirmative side, and boy did we win. 60% of those who could vote, members of the society, said yes to that. Despite the fact that in the course of doing 40 interviews in England that trip, I found that the media people knew nothing about the subject. And there were many times when I asked about these reports, who'd read what, that nobody had read anything. 60 to 40 at Historical Oxford University. So if you're a believer, you're at the cream of the crop, not at the bottom of the barrel, and it's time to stop being an apologist ufologist or a closet ufologist. Tell it like it is. Over 700 lectures, I've had 10 hecklers. 2 of them were drunk, and the audience took care of the other 8. Never had a tomato or an egg. I shouldn't say that. That's a challenge. No, it's okay. You don't need to throw. Okay, let me get back to my question. Let's turn the projector off. Maybe somebody can hit that one light back there and give a little more light. There are 3 boxes up there. I don't know. There you go. We just made you. That's enough. That's enough. We don't want to wake you up too much. Okay, how come the big shots haven't jumped on the bandwagon of pro-ufology, if you will? I think there are 4 reasons. One could spend an hour on each, which of course I won't. The first is ignorance of the relevant data. I've talked to as many as 2,000 people at once, 1,000 engineers and scientists at once. I never get any more than a couple % who've read any of these documents. But the noisiest negativism always comes from those who know the least about the subject. Now, I happen to believe that if one is expressing a purportedly professional opinion from a publicly appointed pedestal because one is Professor so-and-so, Doctor so-and-so, Editor so-and-so, one has a very serious obligation. Namely, to know what one is talking about, which certainly means to have studied the relevant data. And if you haven't, you ought to shut up. Don't misunderstand. We're all entitled to personal opinions about everything. But professional opinions are supposed to require knowledge and ethics, something sadly lacking in the noisy negativist pronouncements from on high. Scratch a debunker and you find somebody who's putting down what he isn't up on. First problem, then, ignorance. The second is different. It's what I call the laughter curtain, like the old Iron Curtain. Some of you are old enough to remember the Iron Curtain, I guess. Fear of ridicule. UFO sightings are common. I check all my audiences. Typically 10% believe they've seen one, which matches the polls. But then I say, how many of you reported what you saw? I'm lucky if it's 1 in 10 of the 10%. Reason for not reporting? Most common, they'd think I was some kind of a nut. It's time to lift the laughter curtain. The subject's too important to be left in the hands of the cartoonists and comedians and Steve Spielbergs and Carl Sagans of the world. And we are making progress. A number of professional groups have gotten involved. Television is showing more UFO stuff, some of it rotten, than ever before. I'm bullish about ufology. We're heading in the right direction. We got a long way to go. There have been, for example, only a dozen PhD theses. There's room for 50, I would think. Any volunteers out there would be happy to make some suggestions. So we've got ignorance, laughter curtain. The third reason the big shots haven't jumped on the bandwagon, ego, E-G-O. You see, if alien spacecraft are visiting planet Earth and the guys or gals on board don't want to talk to the guys who think they're the big shots on the planet, it makes those big shots feel less important than they'd like to think they are. Two groups in particular seem to have this problem: journalists and astronomers. I was in a small college town, called the local newspaper to see if they wanted to attend my lecture that evening at the college. And a guy just ranted at me. We wouldn't waste 2 seconds on this kind of nonsense. And he went on, and finally he finished me off with a flourish. If aliens were visiting planet Earth, they'd have called a press conference and I would have been invited. The other group, astronomers. One astronomer once wrote, Harvard University astronomer, if aliens were visiting planet Earth, they would certainly wish to talk to the National Academy of Sciences, of which both he and his good friend Dr. Condon were members. And the whole attitude was, haven't asked for an appointment, must not be visiting here. What are they going to learn from the members of the National Academy, except how little we know on a cosmic scale? Actually, the ego problem goes a little deeper than that. Flying saucers finished the job that old Nicolaus Copernicus, remember the old Polish astronomer, died in 1543, the same year in which his book was published, in which he made the outrageous suggestion that, this is hard to believe, that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. The sun was. He was smart enough to not let the book be published until he died, because somebody else got burned at the stake for agreeing with him. Matter of fact, the book was banned, guys in white coats, prayer robes, for 300 years. We got new guys in white coats. Now they're lab coats, and they have just as much trouble with not being at the top of the heap. Okay, we've got ignorance, laughter curtain, ego. I'll put my own professional hat back on. I have the dubious distinction of having worked on more canceled government-sponsored advanced research and development programs probably than anybody. I didn't set out to do that, but the fourth problem is a complete unwillingness to use our knowledge of technology to try to understand flying saucer behavior. I mean, it's 1996, not 1926. The objections, especially in the early days, in the 40s, were all along the line with what people claimed to have observed was obviously impossible, so they couldn't have observed it. Now, that's backwards science. The observations are real, whether you understand them or not, it's entirely beside the point. There used to be a whole long list of these impossibles. The list has shrunk as we've accomplished them, of course. But there's one that you'll still hear, usually from astronomers for reasons that I cannot fathom. And it goes like this. They say, look, we think there's life all over the place out there. And some of that life is more advanced than we are. But you can't get here from there. So let's build a radio telescope, spend a few bucks, and we'll listen for signals, because undoubtedly the more advanced civilizations out there are trying to attract our attention. Hello, Earth! Hello, Earth! Just waiting for us to join the galactic radio network. And when we do, they will then transmit to us all the secrets of the universe, said one professor. Did you ever hear such silly drivel in your life? Why would an advanced civilization give its secrets to a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare? That's us, in case you don't recognize that description. Can you get here from there or not? Well, that's a good scientific question. Let's go to the literature. What a track record the astronomers have. Way back, 1903, October. A great astronomer of the last century, Simon Newcomb, wrote a paper considering the possibility of flight. His bottom line was that the only way man would ever fly would be with the help of a balloon. That was 3 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. When he was informed of that, he said, well, maybe a pilot, but certainly never carry any passengers. He wasn't too sharp on aeronautics, obviously. 20 years later, another astronomer proved it would be impossible to give anything sufficient energy to get it into orbit around the Earth. We know how accurate that one was. My favorite, perhaps because I live in Canada, I'm an American and a Canadian, 1941, Dr. Campbell, professor, University of Western Ontario, an astronomer. He was sick and tired of all this science fiction nonsense about going to the moon. He was going to show that that was absurd. So he did a, quote, scientific, unquote, study asking this question. It's a relevant question. What's the required initial launch weight of a chemical rocket able to get a man to the moon and back? How big's the darn thing have to be? Pages of equations and calculations. Bottom line, the required initial launch weight of a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back would have to be 1,000,000 tons. Even for me, that's too big. Less than 30 years later, 3 guys got to the moon and back, still with a dumb old chemical rocket whose initial launch weight was all of 3,000 tons. He was only off a factor of 300 million. Now, when astronomers do calculations about space travel, they're almost invariably astronomically in error. Why? Because it's something about which they know nothing. There is nothing in their training, their education, their background, their experience that tells them anything about what is basically an engineering problem. Now, I still haven't answered the question, and perhaps you're wondering, well, how could he be so stupid? What assumptions did he make? Oh, some odd ones, like a single-stage rocket. Not a good idea. Like a limit of 1g acceleration. Terrible idea. Like launching straight up. We don't do that. One of the silliest, he assumed correctly that when you're coming back to Earth, you're going 25,000 miles an hour, you got to slow down. That's a reasonable notion. But he assumed that the only way he could do it was to fire a retro rocket. But of course, every pound of propellant you use at the end of the trip had to be launched from the Earth at the beginning, slow down at the moon, launched from the moon, slow down back here. What do? We say, hey, stupid, you can't build a rocket that big. Why don't we use the atmosphere? God put it there. We don't need to provide it. We convert the brute force, lifting all that stuff, to being clever. You got to come in at the correct angle. Too steep and you dig a hole in the ground. Too shallow, it's bye-bye Earth. But when you do those things properly, it doesn't take any retro rocket propellant. It's how you go about it that matters. Now, I still haven't answered the question. Can you get to the stars or not? Nearby stars, of course. Local galactic neighborhood, of course. Well, not on a bicycle. But there have been a number of papers published by respectable aeronautical engineers showing that trips to nearby stars are feasible with round-trip time shorter than the average person's lifespan without violating any of our most sacred laws of physics and using staged, you know about staging a rocket, big one, smaller one, smallest, staged fission or fusion nuclear rocket propulsion systems, on both of which I have worked, for those of you where the gears are turning and you're saying, here comes the science fiction. What do I mean by fission or fusion rockets? Well, one picture's worth 1,000 words, so let's turn the projector, let's turn the lights back down just a bit. This is a nuclear rocket reactor propulsion system. This one was developed by Los Alamos. Reactors in here, nozzle up here, liquid hydrogen comes in cold, goes down and around, gets heated in the reactor and goes out. Hot. Very hot. Westinghouse, when I worked for them, we worked on a similar system. Aerojet General had a similar system. The biggest one of these, the Phoebus 2B, sort of a first cousin, was this big. Power level? A mere 4,400 megawatts, twice the power of the old Grand Coulee Dam. At that time, the most powerful nuclear reactor ever operated in the free world. A nuclear rocket propulsion system. Oh, the program was canceled like most of the other things I worked on, but the reactor worked. And in case you're wondering about that, here's one in operation. This is not Walt Disney, in other words. I hate to tell you where the test was run, but I guess I have to. Jackass Flats, Nevada. Make of that what you will. That's nuclear fission. I'm really much more excited about nuclear fusion. Fusion is the most important source of energy in all our lives. You know, the sun up there, it's not a mass of burning gas, no Shell oil, no Gulf oil. The sun is a fusion factory. That's the process that produces the energy. Over 30 years ago, I worked on nuclear fusion propulsion systems for deep space travel. We only spent a few $1 million. We didn't test hardware. But if you use the right stuff in the right way, you can kick particles out the back end in space, having 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. On a miles per gallon basis, fusion is definitely the way to go. Now, does all of this mean I think aliens get here using fission or fusion? Of course it doesn't, because I left out Friedman's law, named immodestly by me for me. Technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You have to change how you do things. That's not just a better chemical rocket. The physics are entirely different. This laser is not just a better light bulb, different physics. The micro-integrated circuits that make today's incredible computers possible are not just small vacuum tubes. You got to change how you do things. And you're probably wondering, well, what's this got to do with anything? Simply this. Suppose somebody out there somewhere got started on his or her technological kick just a wee bit before we did. Well, there are stars out there that are 5 billion years older than the sun, but let's be conservative. Let's assume they only got started 1 million years before we did. Let's be super conservative. Let's assume they only got started 10,000 years before we did. Let's be Buchanan conservative. They only got started 1,000 years before we did. Would anybody in his right mind tell us what the technology of even 1,000 years will be from now? Nobody I know, because progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. We know how to get to the stars. It's a political choice. Do you want to spend the money like going to the moon 60 years ago? We know how to do it. Just took an enormous amount of effort and top-notch people and $20 billion or so dollars. Minor obstacles for the determined, you know. Okay, now, another area of technology. I'm looking for a pitcher of ice water, and I don't see one. I'm going to die of thirst. But another area of technology. This is EMS-1, Electromagnetic Submarine 1. No moving parts, tested by some college students, University of California, Santa Barbara, Dr. Stuart Way, a Westinghouse scientist, an electromagnetic submarine. No moving parts. If you replace seawater, an electrically conducting fluid, with ionized air, another electrically conducting fluid, it turns out you can get around all the problems of high-speed air travel. It's a long, involved story, and incidentally, the Japanese have built a 100-foot-long electromagnetic ship propulsion system using superconducting magnets. This one only cost a few $1,000s and a lot of cheap grad student labor. If the government had sponsored it, it would have cost $250,000, and it wouldn't have worked, of course, but that's another story. All right, now, up to this point, we've talked about sort of the intellectual side of the question. Facts, data, technology, but the real question is this one, isn't it? Never mind the saucer. Did you see the guys who were driving? Does a nuclear physicist believe in little green men? Well, they're practically never green. They're almost always little, and whether they're men or women or both or neither, I really don't know, but the evidence is overwhelming that responsible, respectable earthlings, people whose testimony you'd like on your side in a court of law, have indeed on many an occasion observed not only saucers sitting on or near the ground, but saucers accompanied by beings, humanoids, creatures, little guys, whatever you want to call them, doesn't much matter. And I don't mean once or twice. The Humanoid Study Group of the Mutual UFO Network, and there are 2 board members of MUFON and myself, Mr. Bletchman at the back, who, the Humanoid Study Group, has collected more than 3,500 observations of humanoids associated with craft. A man named Ted Phillips in Missouri has collected more than 4,400 physical trace cases from 65 countries, cases where the saucer is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, landing gear marks, swirled vegetation. In a quarter of those cases, beings were observed with the craft. Take a half dozen of my professional colleagues who have been working on the abduction phenomena, collectively have investigated well over 1,000 abduction cases. So we're not talking about a once-in-a-lifetime event for the planet. It's an often-in-a-lifetime event. Now, we'll work our way up. We'll start with just a physical trace case. Then we'll move into a run-of-the-mill abduction case. And then, of course, we have to talk about the crashed saucers and the bodies and wreckage and all that sort of stuff. The physical trace is that circle there. Johnson Farm, Delphos, Kansas, population 499, the whole town. Ronnie Johnson, 16, finishing his chores for the evening, was about 75 feet to the left, getting ready to go in for dinner. Looks up. There's a mushroom-shaped object, about 10 feet in diameter, sitting just a foot or two off the ground, and extremely bright. He's temporarily blinded, it's so bright. Not lights on it, but just glowing or something. He's standing there paralyzed, so's his dog, so it isn't psychological, when suddenly this thing takes off, just clearing the shadow you see down here. Now Ronnie can move. He dashes the 250 feet to the house. I've been on the farm. Tries to get his parents to come out and see the flying saucer, and they laugh at him, and he gets mad. You don't need to believe me. Go out inside, and you'll see it for yourself. And they do, and they do see it. It takes a little more effort to convince them that this thing was on their farm, but he gets them to come back to show them. It's dark by now. The ring is glowing. Bottom of the tree is glowing. The board is glowing. This is really weird. His mother reaches down, touches the glowing ring of soil, lifts up her hand. Her fingers are numb. As it happens, she can't take pulses at the rest home where she works part-time for the next couple of weeks. They get a little alarmed by this that night. They call the sheriff's office. He comes out the next day, checks for radioactivity, of course. That's what everybody's frightened about, and there isn't any. Article appears in a local paper, the Delphos Republican. Somebody sends a copy to Ted Phillips in the neighboring state of Missouri, who collects all these reports. He checks with the sheriff. Yeah, known the Johnsons for years, reliable people. Ted goes out there, not expecting to find much. There'd been rain. There'd been snow that had melted. Gets out there, and everything's mud except for the dry ring of soil. Mud inside, mud outside, but the ring was dry. Pours water on it, runs right off. Takes samples all over the place. 14 inches down, the ring is dry. Ran tests. Ring sample, control sample. Ring sample won't grow anything. It's a seed germination test. Kept under identical conditions and just from a few feet apart. Moisture absorption. This is water. It's not glue. It's not plastic. It's water on the ring soil. And in my movie UFOs Are Real, Ted pours, or he's got 2 bowls of water, puts the ring soil on one, it just sits there, normal soil on the other, instant mud. Weird stuff. He sent me samples of the soil. Ring soil on the left, normal soil on the right, from a few feet away, obviously different in color and texture. Had good lab tests done. The ring soil has a higher level of soluble minerals and a lower moisture content than the normal soil. It's too salty if you want to put it in those terms. I hope you notice that very sophisticated soil retention device there. I had a guy tell me after one lecture he couldn't believe anything I said because of that paper plate. I'll tell you, when I was at the University of Chicago, there was a Nobel Prize-winning physics experiment where they used an empty coffee can to hold up an important piece of equipment. They can use coffee cans. I can use paper plates. Anyway, this is the new direction of ufological research. Testing. Something to get your mitts on. Now, in this case, as in 3/4 of the physical trace cases, there were no beings seen. In this case, there were. I don't mean the dog, of course. This is Barney and Betty Hill. I was with Benny a couple of weeks ago in New Hampshire, as a matter of fact, Portsmouth. Famous case. There's a whole book, The Interrupted Journey, by John Fuller. 2 articles in the Old Look magazine, a television movie, The UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones, Estelle Parsons. For those of you who somehow missed it, Benny and Barney were driving south from Montreal, Canada, toward their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. not too far up the road. Middle of the night, September 1961. Beautiful, clear night, no traffic. Barney's driving. Betty's watching out the window, spots a strange light off to the far right, moves around in a peculiar fashion. She's afraid to tell Barney. She knows he's going to laugh at her, but she takes out the binoculars, they're bird watchers, watches it for some time, and finally works up courage enough. Barney, there's a flying saucer out there. Oh, Betty, come on, there are no flying saucers. He looks at it. Must be an airplane, that's what it is, an airplane. Probably a Piper Cub, don't worry about it. Barney, it can't be. Look how it's moving, look at the lights. That's no Piper Cub. Looks again. Must be a helicopter, Betty. They can move around in strange fashion. They argue about it quietly. They're heading south in the valley, straight down the middle of New Hampshire. This thing is following the contour of the hills, moving the same speed they are. Suddenly, it zips out across the highway, across in front of them, and over there to the left. Barney's looking this way. He jams on the brakes, stops the car, grabs the binoculars, gets out of the car, and heads across the field toward it. And Betty's screaming at him, Barney, come back! He's bound and determined he's going to prove to her that there's nothing strange about that strange thing sitting over there. Less than 200 yards away, 60 to 80 feet in diameter, silent, no visible external engines, no wings, no tail, no blinking red and green lights. Ah, but there's a double row of windows. He cranks up the binoculars, scares the heck out of him because there inside are some strange-looking characters staring back at him. Gets very upset. Dashes back to the car, burns rubber. There's some beeping sounds, another set of beeping sounds, and they see a sign that says Concord, New Hampshire, 17 miles. And they discussed that because they both had thought they were at least 50 miles from Concord. There's a lot of other little details. You have to read the book, The Interrupted Journey by John Fuller to get. Anyway, they go on home the next day. Actually, it's early in the morning, but they that day report the case first to the police, and they say, talk to Pease Air Force Base. So they call them, and they tell them about their sighting. They don't mention the beings that Barney had seen in the windows. I mean, this is 1961. Betty is very curious. They go to the library. They get some books. There's one by the head of NICAP, the group that I mentioned before. It gives an address in the back. If you've had a sighting, please write us. So Betty writes a letter describing their sighting, and a month later they hear from a NICAP member who investigates. He has them go over the case chronologically. You know, what time did you leave Montreal? How fast were you driving? How far is it? How much time for coffee and gas? And what time did you get home anyway? When I go over it this way, step by step, it becomes painfully obvious that they got home at least 2 hours later than they should have gotten home. It was suggested then that they be hypnotized to find out what happened during the missing 2 hours. They're both busy people. Betty is social worker, supervisor in the welfare department, state of New Hampshire. Barney worked in the post office down in Boston, but he was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission. They were both very busy people. Betty checks with a colleague of hers, a psychologist, about this missing time. He says, don't worry about it. Wait a while. Your memory will come back. So, okay. They wait. And they wait. And Betty has nightmares. Barney worked nights, so she didn't even tell him about it, about being kidnapped by strange beings. Barney develops an ulcer. Gets so bad he can't work anymore. And the medication isn't working, and the doctor finally suggests that, Barney, I've done what I can for you, but something's wrong here. Why don't you go see Dr. Benjamin Simon down in Boston? He's a psychiatrist who's worked with a lot of shell-shock war veterans, people whose buddy's head was blown off next to them during the war, and they can't integrate that. Maybe there's, something else going on here. So, okay, by now 2 years have gone by. Barney needs to get back to work. They make appointments. They drive every Saturday morning the 60 miles to Boston. Betty waits outside. Barney goes in. Dr. Simon hypnotizes him, has him relive a portion of this experience. Not retell, but relive all the feelings and emotion. Tapes it. Induces amnesia at the end of the session, so he won't remember what he said and can't tell Betty about it. Calms him down. A lot of powerful emotions floating around. Sends him out, brings Betty in, does the same thing with her. This goes on each week for 3.5 months. Separate sessions, neither one of them knowing what's going on in the sessions except for one thing. Barney's ulcer is better. Finally, Dr. Simon figures are ready, brings them both in together, and plays a composite tape, which I have heard, of those earlier sessions. They are astonished to find that they had each independently relived the incredible story of that craft having landed, of them being taken on board against their will, being treated as specimens, stick a needle here, scrape a little skin there, separate rooms. They were put back out, told they wouldn't remember what happened, and didn't until this elaborate, sophisticated, expensive procedure was conducted. Now, let's face it, that's a pretty far-out story. Well, I read the book, The Interrupted Journey, talked to the author, John Fuller, talked to Dr. Simon, read the Look magazine articles, and it was in my gray basket. Everybody needs a gray basket, maybe. And then finally, I had the lucky opportunity in November 1968 to meet with Betty and Barney for 4 hours in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was working and living at that time. Just the three of us. I was impressed, to say the least. They were obviously sensible, sensitive, intelligent people. I buy their story. And you say, big deal, you believe them. So what? Where's the evidence? Well, there's several different directions to look. I'll only talk about one right now. Betty, under hypnosis, is reliving how she's trying to get the leader of this 11-being crew to tell her where he's from. And in the understatement of the decade, she says, I know you're not from around here. Yes, that's true. Anyway, to get her off his back, he shows her what I can only describe as a three-dimensional star map or model. 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. A whole bunch of points of light. But 12 points of light, supposedly stars, connected by 3 different kinds of lines. Heavy trade routes, light trade routes, occasional expeditions. Now, Betty's looking up at this thing, and she asks the alien leader, the only one who seemed to sort of speak English, well, where are you on the map? Wise guy alien. He says, do you know where you are on the map? No, I don't know anything about astronomy. Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at? End of discussion. Now, you know, you can feel a little sympathy for Dr. Simon at this point. I mean, here he's got 2 obviously sensible, sensitive, intelligent people telling him a crazy story. And now he hears about star map and trade routes and expeditions. Oh, boy. He has Betty go over that. He asks her if she can remember what the map looks like. She says yes. He gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. Remember, this is medical hypnosis. This is not parlor game stuff. If and only if she can remember the model accurately, please draw it later on. She goes home. She draws it, brings it in the next session. Here it is right from the book. Now, it's kind of intriguing, indeed. These are the base stars over here. Well, someplace here. I did have a pointer that worked. The base stars in the far right section there. There we go. The regular expeditions and occasional expeditions. And, you know, there's a little problem here, though. What's it mean? We got no reference points. Obviously, it's not our whole galaxy with 300 billion stars in it, or even our local neighborhood, seemingly. I mean, that's got 1,000 stars. We'll never know, so it seemed. And then a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish did something nobody else had ever done. She built a total, now it's up to 26, 3-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. You can see one of these so you'll know what I'm talking about. This one was used at Ohio State University Astronomy Department as a teaching tool for a number of years. There are 256 color-coded beads, each bead standing for a particular star in its proper 3-dimensional location. The purpose of doing this is to be able to look at it from 3 directions, 3 dimensions, if you will, to see if you can find a 3-dimensional pattern that matches the 2-dimensional one that Betty drew. The hard part about doing this is that you obviously need distance data between stars. Now, the astronomers don't care. We know where to aim a telescope to see a star. Whether it's close or far doesn't matter. But to build a model, you need to have the distances. And you used to get 5 different star catalogs out past 20 light years. You get 5 different distances. Marjorie built her models expecting to find many yeses, if you will, matches. Didn't find any. And then a new catalog came out, the Gliese 1969 catalog, Wilhelm Gliese, of nearby stars. Best collection ever put together of star distance data in the local neighborhood. Rebuilt the model, there was the pattern. Angle for angle, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. It was astonishing to Marjorie, to say the least. This is the model that shows that. Now, the sun is up here, way up there. And don't say, where's the Earth? It's so small it wouldn't show up on this scale. Now, several things about the pattern stars, if you will. First of all the stars connected by lines, the pattern stars, are the right kind for planets and life. But gee, only 1 in 22, 46 out of 1,000 are the right kind. And not only are all the pattern stars the right kind for planets and life, but all the right kind of stars for planets and life in this well-defined three-dimensional volume of space are part of the pattern. You've got all the right kind, and only the right kind, even though only 1 in 22 qualifies. The chance of that happening by accident, you grab a dozen stars, just happens to be all and only 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million, depending on whose statistics you believe. It's not a coincidence. Nobody doing what Marjorie did back when Betty saw the pattern in 61 or the book came out in 65 could have identified all the stars, because the correct distance data on 3 of those stars wasn't known until 1969. Where did Betty, a social worker who knew nothing about astronomy, get the right information about where the stars were when nobody on this planet had that information? Had to have come from somebody who was away from our solar system, namely aliens, because none of us had been. Now, a couple of other things. One, all the pattern stars are in a plane, like thin slices of pepperoni on a very thin pizza, as opposed to big fat raisins in a big fat loaf of raisin bread. We don't know why that's the case, and it was never noted before, but it's a great help in traveling between these systems if you're all in a plane, as it happens. Now, of course, this work tells us where those guys originate, which we'd like to know. I would anyway. I presume you would too. Here's the sun up here. Maybe I can get that a little sharper. I'm not sure. There we go. Here's the sun. These numbers, 27 LY, 9.8 LY, 26 LY, that's light years. This is not a shell oil road map, obviously. Now, we're out in the boonies. Behind us, there's nothing for 15 or so light years. The nearest star to the sun is 4.5 light years away. The nearest one we expect to have planets and life, Taus Ceti, is 11 light years away. The base stars, heavy trading routes and all that stuff, 36.6. Let's call it 37 light years. There should be a flourish of trumpets. Zeta 1 Reticuli and Zeta 2 Reticuli. To which the normal response is, who cares? Never heard of those two dumb-sounding stars. What could possibly be special about them? Of course you haven't heard of them. They're run-of-the-mill sun-like stars. You can't even see them from here. You got to go below the equator. That's the constellation Reticulum, the net. Anything special? Well, yes, as it happens, there is. Not known until Marjorie did this splendid work. Those two stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, just happen to be the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. They're 100 times closer to each other than our star, the sun, is to the next star over. We're so far out in the boondocks we can't see the smoke from the next guy's chimney. These guys got next-door neighbors. It wouldn't be surprising at all if there were earlier interstellar travel and your nearest neighbor is only 3 light weeks away, as it is for them, as opposed to our situation of several light years, especially when I tell you something else special. Those two stars are about 1 billion years older than the sun. Progress comes from doing things differently. If they've got 1 billion-year head start, on a cosmic scale, they're a little more advanced than we are, to say the least. That's a very exciting piece of work, controversial piece of work. I published an article with Bobby Ann Slate-Geronda back in the early 70s in Saga magazine, and then I convinced Terry Dickinson, editor of Astronomy magazine, to talk to Marjorie and see if he might not be interested in an article as well. And he did visit her, did talk to a bunch of astronomers, and wrote an article in Astronomy magazine. It got more reaction than anything they'd ever published before or since. Over the next year or so, they published 9 more articles. Then they put together this 32-page full-color reprint of the original article, the subsequent letters, and some new information, beautifully done in color. They sold 10,000 copies just like that. And then Carl Sagan's lawyer, his name was on the front because he had 2 contributions here, his lawyer threatened to sue, and because, as we found out later, the publisher had a brain tumor, we didn't know it at the time, couldn't understand why he caved in. He did cave in, and because I had suggested the article, made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I wound up with 18,000 copies of this in my garage in California. There's about 1,200 in my basement in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and about 40 up here. If you want both sides of the story, this is a good place to get. And if you want to know who our neighbors are, excellent place to get that information. Exciting piece of work, and as you would expect, all the attacks on it incorrectly represent what was done in the first place. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up, and that includes the attacks by Carl Sagan. Now, in this story, there were no souvenirs brought back. No T-shirts, "I survived the Zeta Reticulan abduction," you know. No ashtrays, no matchbooks. It's hard to imagine these guys smoking a cigar. Boy, that would be a cartoon, wouldn't it? Here's what they look like, in case you're wondering. This is a drawing done by a New Hampshire artist, David Baker, sitting next to Barney, as Barney under hypnosis described what they look like. A police artist drawing of a kidnapper, if you want to put it in those terms. Skull shape different from ours, big eyes, small nose, small mouth, small ears. You know, it's your typical Zeta Reticulan. What else can I say? Now, here's a bust done from a bunch of drawings like the ones you just saw. This was used as a model for the masks of the actors who played the aliens in the television movie, The UFO Incident. I was technical advisor. I walked in with the slide and they started shaping the clay. That is rare responsiveness for Hollywood, believe me. It is interesting to note the characteristics here. No hair, practically no ears, mouth, nose, big eyes. And I mention that because we'll be talking briefly about Mr. Santilli's alien autopsy footage. And if that's an alien, then I'm a brain surgeon. What did he say? No, he's not a brain surgeon. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, I started to say no souvenirs here. Some people would think that that means that all we have is anecdotes. Of course, that leaves out radar visual sightings, all the rest, but is that true? No, of course it isn't true. Why do I say that? Well, let's look. Let's see if we can... This is a Chicago Daily News, major newspaper. Then, doesn't exist now. Evening paper, July 8th, 1947. Forget the All-Star game. Army finds air saucer on ranch in New Mexico. Disc goes to high officers, picked up last week. Dateline, Roswell, New Mexico. And the article went down, just a short paragraph here. Chicago. Let's move an hour west. Roswell, New Mexico. Now, this is an article many people have seen, and they think that's the only place it appeared. This is Roswell Army Airfield, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. No details of flying disc are revealed. That's that whole long article. This one is a detailed article about flying saucers, and General Nathan Twining saying it's not ours, U.S. government. This is about flying saucers. Was a big deal back then. Well, let's move an hour west. Can't get a bigger headline than that one. Army finds flying saucer. Now you have to understand where this paper is from. Los Angeles, evening paper, July 8th, 1947, but we already have the cover story. The second line there, the headline, General believes it is radar weather gadget. Now, that's the only paper I've seen that has both headlines. There may be one in Hawaii. If there is, I haven't seen it. I'd love to. Now, what's going on here? First, we need a context. June 24th, big sighting, 9 flying objects that moved as a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. Pilot out in the Pacific Northwest, broad daylight, not only observed 9 strange craft, but he timed their flight between 2 mountains, and it turned out to be at a speed of about 1,500 miles an hour. He knew the distance between the 2 mountains. The speed record at that time was 625 miles an hour. Figured they were secret government systems, but he reported them. Within the next 2 weeks, there were sightings in 44 states. Over 2,000 reports are on file. Several other countries, too, incidentally. Lots of headlines. Now, on about July 2nd, apparently 2 saucers crashed, maybe a mid-air collision, I don't know, in New Mexico. And one went, the debris went near a little town called Corona, 15 miles, 75 miles northwest of Roswell. And later we have reason to think bodies were found a couple miles east of there. The other one came down almost intact out in the plains of San Agustin in New Mexico, 160 miles west or so. There were bodies next to that one. Now, the sheriff's office in Roswell received a visitor on Sunday, July 6th. A man named Mac Brazel. It was on his ranch that the debris was found. And he'd already told the nearest neighbor, Loretta Proctor, 10 miles away, his nearest neighbor, he'd brought some of the wreckage over to her. He'd heard a tremendous explosion. He was sure it wasn't thunder. The night before, went out the next day. Here's this area, 3/4 of a mile long, a few hundred feet wide, strewn with very strange wreckage. At least 3 different types of stuff. A foil-like material, about the weight of aluminum foil, except you'd crunch it down, it would spring back. You'd fold it, it would unfold. You couldn't cut it. Very strange, very strong, very lightweight. There's some solid material, very thin, very lightweight. You couldn't break through with a sledgehammer. There were I-beam-like pieces, about 3/8 inches high, about the weight of balsa wood, nothing to them. But you couldn't cut them, burn them, break them, and they had pastel symbols, lavender color no less, inside the eye. A bunch of strange stuff. The rancher goes into the sheriff with some of this stuff on Sunday. The sheriff calls the base, Roswell Army Airfield, home of the 509th, the only atomic bombers in the country. Talks to base intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel. You're supposed to do that. Marcel checks with his boss after checking out the wreckage. Colonel Blanchard, later to become a 4-star general at age 48, later to become Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, unfortunately having a heart attack in the Pentagon and dying before he could become Chief of Staff. Colonel Blanchard tells Major Marcel, take one of the counterintelligence corps guys out with you, follow the rancher out and see what you can find. They had to follow him out because there's no way to describe where the place was. There aren't any landmarks or stuff. You'll see in a picture in a minute. They go out, Major Marcel and a man named Cavett, a counterintelligence corps officer. They follow the rancher out, spend their overnight in sleeping bags. The next day he shows them all this stuff. They filled 2 vehicles with it. Major Marcel's looking for a crater, doesn't see any, so it had to be an above-the-ground explosion. They head back. Late at night, Major Marcel stops at home, wakes his wife and 11-year-old son, Jesse Marcel Jr., who is, as it happens, a medical doctor, a pilot, a flight surgeon, served on military aircraft accident investigative teams, was himself shot down in Southeast Asia, in a country I can't name because we weren't officially there. It starts with a C. The son is very important. Major Marcel is dead. The son has never seen anything like this material, and he's helped recreate with an engineer a replica, which I'll show you a picture of a little later. But I'd sure like his testimony on my side in a court of law, as I would his father's, for that matter. Next morning, Jesse goes into the base. Colonel Blanchard, base commander, gives 2 orders. One of them is to Jesse. Get one of the B-29 crews to take you in that wreckage up to Wright Field in Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, that's where captured enemy equipment normally goes for evaluation, back engineering, etc. Make a stop at our headquarters. The 509th was part of the 8th Air Force, headquartered in Fort Worth, Texas. It's right on the way. Second order he gives out is to the base public information officer, a guy named Walter Hart. And put out a press release saying we've recovered the wreckage of one of these flying discs people have been seeing the last couple of weeks. Well, Walter does as he's told at noon, New Mexico time, too late for all the morning newspapers in the country, just in time to make the evening papers from Chicago west. That's at noon, New Mexico time. Jesse and a B-29 and the wreckage get to Fort Worth, Texas. A few hours later, General Roger Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force, Colonel Blanchard's boss, greets him and tells him, you don't say anything, I'll take care of it. And the reason for that is, as I found out from Colonel Thomas Jefferson Dubose, then Colonel, later retired General, he had taken a call from the head of the Strategic Air Command, 509th up to the 8th Air Force is part of the Strategic Air Command. Clements McMullen, a general, whom Colonel Dubose knew, called him and said 3 things, 3 orders. 1, I want you to get the press off our backs. I don't care how you do it. Get rid of that story. 2, send one of your Colonel Couriers up here today with some of that wreckage. And 3, I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your boss, Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing? No, sir. When a 2-star general gives a colonel orders, he does what he's told. So when Jesse shows up, General Ramey says, you don't say anything. I'll take care of it. Gentlemen of the press, we made a bad mistake. Wasn't a flying saucer at all. Just a radar reflector from a weather balloon, and he had the wreckage brought in of such a device. And the press looked at it, wouldn't let him touch it. They took pictures. I'll show you some of those later. What are you going to do with it, General? Throw it out, of course. What else would you do with it? Well, as a matter of fact, we have an FBI memo proving that a special flight was sent up to Wright Field with that stuff. Funny treatment for a weather balloon radar reflector, wouldn't you say? Well, cover story goes out, next day's paper, all over the country, Ramey empties Roswell saucer. That ended all the sightings just like that because, or the reports of the sighting, because everybody knew now what was being seen. Doesn't match at all what was seen, but what difference does that make? They'd spoken. But the Air Force wasn't satisfied with that. They actually staged a launch of a radar reflector from a weather balloon to demonstrate that that's what it was over at Alamogordo Army Airfield. These 3 pictures all apply to that. Fantasy of Flying Disc is explained here. This whole long article here is about it. That went out on the wire services. That was it, until I got involved 31 years later. Now, I want to clear up a false impression. If you listen to the Air Force and their report in which they say this, well, we lied back then. It wasn't really a weather balloon radar reflector. It was a mogul balloon radar reflector. Why we should believe them now, I don't know, but they said how the story came out. They said in 1978, a tabloid newspaper, the National Enquirer, carried an article saying that Jesse Marcel was claiming that he had recovered the wreckage of a flying saucer in 1947 at Roswell. Also in 1978, a UFO researcher, they can't call me nuclear physicist now, that wouldn't be cricket, Stanton Friedman, met with Marcel and started looking for other witnesses. They've tabloidized the story, and they've gotten away with it. Well, isn't that the truth? Like heck, it's the truth. This story came to light because in February 1978, I was at a television station in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I had done 2 interviews. I was speaking that night at LSU. I was due to do 1 more interview, and the reporter was late, thank goodness. The station manager was entertaining me, giving me coffee, chit-chatting, He was embarrassed because he knew I had a busy day. Finally, out of the blue, he says, "You know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel." "Who's he?" "Oh, he handled pieces of the wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military." That got my attention. "Well, where's he live?" "Oh, over in Houma, Louisiana." I had no idea where that is. I've been there, though, now. We're old ham radio buddies." Good man. Okay, the reporter shows up. Next day from the airport, I call information, talk to Jesse Marcel after getting his number. He tells me his story. Now, the trouble is he didn't remember the date. I mean, we're talking 1978. This is 1947. He wasn't sure just when it happened. Okay, a few months later, I'm in Bemidji, Minnesota. Two people come up to me afterward, a couple, telling me that a friend of theirs, Barney Barnett, a Soil Conservation Service engineer for the U.S. government in New Mexico, had stumbled across a saucer stuck in the ground with bodies next to it, strange bodies. They didn't remember the date. And I shared both those stories with William Moore, a co-researcher who was living in Minnesota at the time. Bill came up with a third story. An English actor, Huey Green, driving across the country, this is published in some obscure place, I heard on the radio about a crashed flying saucer, but when he got to Philadelphia, he didn't hear anything more. And he was very curious. We were able to get back to him. He's Canadian, basically, though he lives in England. Spoke to him on the phone just 3 weeks ago. Huey said that when this happened was the first week in July, 1947. I passed this on to my associate, William Moore. He went to the University of Minnesota Library, started looking through the newspapers. There was the story. That gave us the names of all kinds of people, lots of little detail to check on. Now, what about that National Enquirer story? Well, the interview took place in December 1979, and it didn't appear until February 1980, by which time Bill Moore and I had already talked to 60 people. So instead of scientists seeks, saucer recovery information, we have tabloid story from angry old man, or words to that effect. Now, in the television movie, Roswell, we have Jesse Marcel attending a reunion of his old guys, and he was trying to vindicate himself because he was badly treated. Hogwash. There was no such reunion. Of course, there was no such autopsy that we know about either, but it's Hollywood. There's an English show that was on the Learning Channel. The story came to light when WWL in New Orleans carried it on television in 1980. More hogwash. I filmed Jesse for my movie UFOs Are Real in 1979. I was in that WWL story. The book was already out. So that says be careful what you hear on television. Now, let's get to some specifics here, a little more data. I ask everybody who wants to have some fun, go dig in your library to look at newspapers from, say, June 25th to July 12th, 47. You'll be amazed at how many stories. But back here, I don't think you'll find any about Roswell on the 8th. The story came out too late, unless there was a late edition. If you find any, let me know. We need a map of New Mexico to have a little better idea here, and I want to bring in something that's directly relevant to Worcester. Here's Roswell down here. Here's Albuquerque up here, 192 miles of nothing between the two places. Here is the Corona site. Here's the little town of Corona. That other crash, Barney Barnett crash, was way over here in the plains of San Augustine, out in the middle of nowhere. This big, huge yellow area here is White Sands Missile Range, 4,000 square miles. Alamogordo Army Airfield was next to it. Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, Sandia National Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, Roswell. The military presence was incredible in New Mexico. Now, something else happened in Roswell that you ought to be interested in. That's the town in which Robert Goddard did his research from 1930 to 1941. There's a Robert Goddard High School there. They have recreated his workshop at the local museum. He's considered something of a hero there. First multi-stage rocket out of town. There's a lot more room in New Mexico than there is here. You remember that authorities were a little upset about his firing rockets? Incidentally, Todd mentioned that New York Times article. What they really said was that everybody knows that a rocket wouldn't work in a vacuum because there's nothing to push against. I think, how many years was it? It was in the late 40s that they ran a little correction from this article that they'd had almost 20 years earlier. I don't know what the date of that article was. They were wrong. It would work in a vacuum because it's the exhaust work pushing against the rocket, not against the air, that makes it work. But they're a little slow. So here we have Roswell, New Mexico, home of the only atomic bombing group in the world, home of the early research, a lot of good research by Robert Goddard, and also the place where a crashed flying saucer was retrieved. And if you go there, incidentally, there are two UFO museums. One of them has had more than 70,000 visitors in the last few years. It's UFO town, if you will. And wait until next year, 50th anniversary, huge celebration. Okay. There's Major Marcel with some of the wreckage. Phony wreckage. Now, the Air Force says that this is a radar reflector from a weather balloon. That's what it is. They said those strange symbols are from tape used on the radar reflector, and they had the CIA analyze these pictures. As if they'd made a great discovery about the pictures. I'd found them back in the 70s. Somehow they couldn't find those symbols in this fancy tape that was supposedly there. The CIA can analyze things pretty well, one hopes. That's in General Ramey's office. That's General Ramey on the left, Thomas Jefferson Dubose on the right, with some of this phony wreckage. Nothing to do, and I asked Dubose before he died, of course, whether this stuff was what he had, was the real wreckage. Of course not. It was a cover-up, intentional, by order. There was Tommy before his death. Now, he's a typical Roswell-related witness. 18,000 hours as a pilot, a West Point grad, set up the Air Force's search and rescue teams, chief of staff to the head of the 8th Air Force. I'd like a guy on my side like that in a court of law. Super guy. Major Marcel, if you qualify to be the intelligence officer for the only atomic bombing group in the world, you got to have something on the ball. His son, medical doctor, etc., he's got something on the ball too. I stress this because I've heard noisy negativists say, just a bunch of UFO nuts, of course. Not mentioning the 509th, the unique character, all the rest of this. And I resent it, frankly. I've been in his home, in Marcel's home, in Walter Haut's home. Now, 3 more witnesses. Loretta Proctor, you've seen her on television recently. She was the nearest neighbor. She handled some of the wreckage back then. Her brother, Robert Porter, as it happens, was at the base, and he was a crew member on that plane that went to Fort Worth. Bob Shirkey still lives in Roswell. He was the operations officer, and he set up the B-29 and watched some of the wreckage be paraded past him and onto the plane. These are real people. There's Sappho Henderson. Her husband was Pappy Henderson, a noted pilot at the base. And in about 1981, he saw a newspaper article about this crash saucer. The first book came out in 1980, remember. And he told Sappho that he'd always wanted to tell her about this, but it was classified. But now if there's a newspaper article, obviously he can talk about it. He flew some of that wreckage to Wright Field, and he saw the bodies. Now, he's dead. And another researcher who's collected 50 stories about crash saucers printed the story but wouldn't tell me where she was. Unsolved Mysteries agreed to pay the bill when I was looking for people for their program about this. I located her, got the names of people to whom Pappy might have spoken, contacted them. He died in '86. Found one, a retired Air Force colonel who's World War II bombardier, no less, who wrote me a beautiful letter. What a great pilot Pappy was. And yes, Pappy, at their last reunion together in 1980-something or other in Tennessee, had told them the story. Now, after the show was on, the Unsolved Mysteries program, the first one was seen by 29 million people. The second showing, 30 million people. After the first showing, Sappho heard from a mutual friend that said, hey, you know, Pappy told John Kromschroeder. Contacted him. He was a dentist, an old friend of Pappy's. It turned out that Pappy had told him the story in 1978 on his honor as a former naval officer, never to repeat it. And in 1979, handed him a piece of the wreckage. John's the one on the left, which he unfortunately took back. Now, I mention this because if Pappy had a piece, other people had pieces. And I've got a lab in California all ready to go if you know somebody who's got a piece of wreckage from Roswell. We need deathbed confessions, pre-deathbed confessions. It's not too late if you know anybody who claims quietly to know where there's a piece of it. Now, this is the replica. This dimension is like 3/8 inch in the real thing, with the strange symbols as drawn by Dr. Jesse Marcel. Now, they look nothing at all like the symbols on the strange wreckage that was in that alien autopsy footage. The bodies look nothing like the witnesses described the bodies. Body proportions, the ears, everything different. I got a lot of reasons, we'll talk about that in a minute, about saying it's not genuine stuff. The museum has some of these for sale, $19, I think, $19.95, extruded. It made Jesse shiver when he saw this stuff, Junior. Now, I mentioned another crash. This is out in the plains of St. Augustine. It used to be a lake bed, that's why it's so flat. And it happens to be the location today of the world's largest radio telescope. Because the land is flat as can be, there's 28 dishes on a Y-shaped pattern, 13 miles on each leg of the Y. And because it's surrounded by mountains, you can see a few of them here, the radio background noise is very low. This is not there because they recovered the wreckage of a flying saucer and alien bodies there, as far as I know. Land was cheap. The circumstances were great. This is where that Barney Barnett story took place. After Unsolved Mysteries, we got new witnesses. This is a drawing. There's a gash on the other side of this. 4 bodies alongside the dish, stuck in the vehicle, stuck in the ground. 2 dead, 1 dying, 1 alive. And no, I don't know where the live one is or went. I've got several suggestions, but who knows? The government does not send me reports from their progress on this project, which doesn't surprise you. What those guys really look like? This is a drawing. 4 long fingers, no thumb. Funny, those Santilli aliens had 6 digits. Big eyes, practically no ears, nose, mouth, unlike the autopsy alien. About the size of a 6-year-old. Independent testimony from a nurse to a mortician at Roswell. Different bodies, but again, skinny and 4 fingers. And upper arm longer than lower arm, incidentally. Independent from this testimony. Now, the Air Force published first a 25-page report, this mogul balloon explanation, and I would have brought it, except it's too darn heavy. They then published a $52 volume, almost 1,000 pages, with more about mogul balloon than any rational person would want to know. My colleague Bill Moore met with the engineer in a mogul project back in the early 80s. My co-author Don Berliner and I met with him several years ago. There's nothing new about this idea. It doesn't fit the facts. But the GAO went after trying to get the truth about this, and they talked to the CIA and all kinds of other organizations, and the FBI. Now, they didn't talk to all the witnesses. Even the Air Force didn't, even though they claimed to. They didn't talk to Jesse Marcel Jr. They didn't talk to the rancher's son. They both handled wreckage. Didn't talk to Loretta Proctor. They mentioned an FBI memo. The Air Force did. And they left out a key sentence. They were talking about, it talked about balloons, And they leave out a phrase that says telephonic conversation has not borne out that suggestion. They literally lied. They quoted from the newspaper article about the rancher the Air Force did, and they left out the next sentence, which was, I am sure it wasn't a weather balloon. The technology of the balloons was nothing special. The objective was special. Mogul was supposed to stay at a constant altitude, listen for signals from a Soviet nuclear explosion. Now, it's funny, when the GAO talked to the FBI, that one memo that I mentioned was mentioned. This one was not. Let me read a sentence here. What happened was the Air Force, mid-July 1947, asked the FBI for help in investigating, checking on people. I mean, that's what the FBI is good at. And there were several comments in response by high-level FBI officials. We should, we shouldn't. I think we should do this. This was Clyde Tolson. Then from J. Edgar Hoover himself, I would do it, help the Air Force. But before agreeing to it, we must insist upon full access to disks recovered. For instance, and then you can't read these two letters, SW, Southwest, LA, who knows, case, the Army grabbed it and would not let us have access for cursory examination. Nobody talks about this memo. Doesn't disks recovered sound rather intriguing? Does to me. I mean, from J. Edgar Hoover himself. And this came as a result of a Freedom of Information request with 2,000 pages of FBI documents, after they had written people that they had nothing about UFOs, of course. What's a little lie between friends? So this case is complex. It's exciting. This is the first book. Berlitz did the writing. Bill Moore and I did 90% of the research. Berlitz threw in garbage. They got sued, actually, by an astronaut for claiming he had said he had seen one on the moon. He won a settlement. When Bill was promoting this book, he was approached by some insiders who said they'd like to help him get to the truth, but they weren't going to go public yet. And they did point him in a lot of good directions. That was 1980. Here's several more books. The paperback version of the Roswell incident didn't come out for 8 years. Now, two books. First, this one, UFO Crash at Roswell, 91. Kevin Randall is a fiction writer who's done 78 books of fiction. Don Schmidt is a rural letter carrier for the U.S. Post Office who tried to pass himself off as a medical illustrator with several degrees, none of which he had. 2 years later or so, 3 years, they put out The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. I was really expecting another volume, The Real Truth, but they had a falling out because Don lied about not working for the post office. And Kevin's got another book himself here. And here's our book, Don Berliner, an aviation and science writer. You know, it's a funny thing. I guess I did deliver the mail for 3 weeks back when I was a college student. But here's Mr. Santilli. He's the guy who's been exploiting that alien autopsy footage. How many of you saw the program Alien Autopsy Fact or Fiction on one of its many births? Quite a few. If you didn't turn your head, you saw me for maybe 20 seconds or so. And of course, I did a 3-hour interview from which they selectively chose the 20 seconds. Now, what do I think about the footage? I've been to England 5 times this past year. I've met with Mr. Santilli twice. We've had numerous phone conversations. I can find absolutely nothing about the footage that leads me to believe it has a connection with Roswell, crash saucers, alien bodies. Nothing matches. Every time I checked on Mr. Santilli, he wasn't telling the truth. For example, he said the name of the cameraman in a quiet conversation last April was Jack Barnett, the first man to film Elvis Presley. He had bought that early footage, or the rights to it, and then the cameraman, Jack Barnett, told him, well, I've got something else you might be interested in. That led to the footage. Military cameraman, he took the footage. Well, there was a Jack Barnett, and he was the first to film Elvis Presley. The only trouble is he was not in the military, and he died in 1967. Pretty hard to buy any rights from him then. Then the name was Jack Barrett. He died. He was in the military, but got out in 45, was never a motion picture cameraman. The latest name I've heard is Jack Bennett, and I expect next month we'll have Garrett and Gannett and whoever knows what. My first conversation, Mr. Santilli told me you could clearly see President Truman in the footage. This shocked me. I said, and he said, we even were able to show that he was in Dallas at the time of the autopsy. I said, you checked the Truman Library? Yes. Of course, now he says the autopsy was in Fort Worth and it was earlier and all this stuff, but I checked with the Truman Library. Truman wasn't in New Mexico or Texas from June through October. I confronted Mr. Santilli with that in June. Well, the trip was in conjunction with his trip to Ottawa. Shows you how good his geography is. Ottawa is 450 miles directly north of Washington. He did go there in mid-June. Dallas is 1,100 miles southwest. But the trip to Ottawa was by train, and it was public. Now, I don't know what... Oh, also, that the film was dated by Kodak. Very impressive. Well, it turns out it wasn't. Kodak requires 50 frames, it's about 2 seconds worth of film, that shows the images in it that are in the program. Full width. They've never gotten it. They're the only ones who can analyze the footage. He had given them some leader, which could have been from anything. So the saga goes on. There's still hints that the cameraman is going to be interviewed. I don't think there is a real cameraman. There's a transcription of a supposed phone conversation with him that's loaded with English phrases rather than American phrases. And having just been over there for 2 weeks and a lot of time this past year, we don't speak the same language all the time. So I don't know where this is going. I think it's been totally reprehensible that Fox Network would run a show, that Channel 4 in England would run a show. It's been shown in 36 countries without pinning it down, validating it. I mean, if you get a picture and you say, gee, I think this is by Rembrandt. How do you know? Well, the guy who sweeps the floor next door said it looked like a Rembrandt to him. Isn't that good enough? No, it isn't. Okay. There's the bodies. Incidentally, if you look carefully, there is a wedge there. It looks as if the hand had been chopped off and added on, and it doesn't show up later on. It's like one of the so-called doctors pushed it back on. Is it a fraud, or is it real footage of a genetically handicapped person? I don't know. But the burden is on them. There is talk that an English company has hoaxed it. They love to do hoaxes over there, and may come forward. I'll believe that when I see it too. But recently, 3 old Army Air Force cameramen have been located. They have a long, long list of reasons why this stuff isn't genuine. Would have been shot in color film, and it would have been done with a camera on the ceiling and another one on a tripod. There would have been a guy taking stills and all this sort of stuff. None of that works out. I hope I didn't offend anybody on the air. They covered the genital regions, and in England they did not, so I didn't either. Now, very controversial. My book comes out of this, will get as much noise, I suppose, as the footage. Obviously, if the government recovered 2 crash flying saucers and alien bodies, they would have done something, probably set up a project like the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, because that's where most of the Manhattan Project was. That seemed likely, but we didn't know, where do you find out? In December 1984, Bill Moore, an associate of ours, I had moved to the East Coast, he was still on the West Coast, got a roll of film in the mail in which there were 2 sets of 8 negatives each of a top-secret MAJIC, M-A-J-I-C, eyes only, briefing for President-elect Eisenhower, dated 18 November, 1952, 2 weeks after Ike was elected for the first time. In this briefing, it describes a recovery of a crashed flying saucer outside Roswell, New Mexico. and the establishment of a group called Operation Majestic 12, accountable only to the President of the United States to deal with it. It named the members of the team, a lot of other little detail, listed a bunch of attachments, and page 8 is a memo from President Truman to James Forrestal establishing Operation Majestic 12. And of course the question is whether the documents are genuine. When I heard the names of the people on the group, I certainly had my doubts. Now, I just want to run through these real quick. It's an all-star cast. The briefing officer was Admiral Hillenkoetter. He was the director of Central Intelligence when this happened in '47. Vannevar Bush, there's a Vannevar Bush building over at MIT. He was head of the Manhattan Project, basically, during the war, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They did 90 different technical projects. Outstanding engineer scientist with the Carnegie Institution then. Forrestal was the first Secretary of Defense. General Nathan Twining at the time was head of the Air Materiel Command in Ohio. It was his people in New Mexico who launched those radar reflectors, Fantasy, a flying disc, invented here. He went on to become a saltier. He was Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. All these guys were dead when we got the film. Vandenberg was a half step ahead of Twining and was the second Director of Central Intelligence and the second Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Twining was his Vice Chief. Dr. Detlef Bronk, aviation physiologist, was president of Johns Hopkins University, president of Rockefeller University, head of the National Academy of Sciences, head of the National Research Council, every committee in Washington he seemed to be on. Hunsaker was at MIT, head of the old NACA, National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, the wind tunnel guys. Sidney Sowers, first director of Central Intelligence, first executive secretary of the National Security Council. Gordon Gray had been Secretary of the Army, head of the Psychological Strategy Board for the CIA, Ike's National Security Advisor. Here was the fly in the ointment, Dr. Donald Menzel, a Harvard University astronomer who'd written 3 anti-UFO books, a debunker. Obviously, this list is, this thing is a fraud because you don't need a high-level security clearance to be a Harvard astronomer. And he was a debunker. Montague was Twining's West Point classmate, head of Fort Bliss in Texas-New Mexico border, and during this very week was named to head a special project at Sandia National Laboratory, Nuclear Weapons Lab in Albuquerque. Berkner was a great scientist, second in command to Bush at Carnegie. Now, Menzel, that's the one that bothered me. But since these guys were all dead, and there was a lot of good stuff in the report, I thought I ought to check it out. Had to get permission from 3 different people, went over to Harvard to look at Menzel's papers, was astonished at the discovery I made that he, Donald Menzel, Harvard University astronomer, led 2 lives. He led eclipse expeditions, he served on all kinds of committees, but he wrote to Jack Kennedy that he, Menzel, had a longer continuous association with the super-secret National Security Agency and its Navy predecessor, 30 years as of 1960, of anybody in the country. He had a top-secret ultra clearance, did all kinds of classified work for the CIA, 30 companies. I didn't like the man when he was alive. I developed a healthy respect for him after finding all these findings. There's a whole chapter about this in Top Secret Magic, but finding that Dr. Menzel fit, which was quite astonishing, had close links with Vannevar Bush and with Berkner and several other people. It's a long story. That encouraged me to go on. I've done a heck of a lot of work since then. I'm convinced the documents are real. I found some other documents that are phony, but call them as you see them. Now, these have been attacked incredibly. This is page 8. This is the authorization from Truman. Now, the signature is supposedly identical to another signature of Truman, and therefore this is a phony. Hold them up to a light table, they are not identical. Oh yeah, but they both got this little mark there. I've got a Truman signature with that little mark where the pen catches. Definitely genuine. Another one. Now, I want to enlarge this, but I want to call your attention. This mentions It's just an authorization. The Secretary of Defense Force will proceed with Majestic 12. And it mentions Vannevar Bush down here, and Dr. Bush, and the Director of Central Intelligence, who was Hillenkoetter, the guy who supposedly did the briefing. But look carefully up here. Well, we'll blow it up. Wait a minute. September 24, 1947, period. The numbers are all offset. And they're done with a different typewriter. No forger would use two typewriters. Now, how about that period at the end of the date? Who uses periods at the end of the date? Vannevar Bush's office did. And I've got something from the same date where the 24, 1947 period matches identically. I found somebody who worked for Truman all the time he was in the White House. Of course, memos were prepared for his signature by other people, and of course he would have signed memos from either Bush or Forrestal. I'm convinced it's genuine. Now, there's a third document which was found. This is the only one we have in hard copy. I know you have trouble reading it, but that's not the point of showing it to you. It's old, real paper. There's a slant red pencil mark through the security mark. It mentions NSC, National Security Council, MJ-12 Special Study Project, and it's to General Twining from Ike's Special Assistant, Robert Cutler. Certainly this would seem to prove that MJ-12 was real, National Security Council. Well, of course, it's been attacked all over the place. Fortunately, you hold it up to the window there at the National Archives, you get a watermark. You find a company that made it. You find that they made it only, this kind of paper, only between 1953 and 1973 in bid lots. Did all kinds of checking on this one. Language matches another memo and so forth. But what really pleases me the most is that because of this memo, I earned $1,000. One of the nastiest, noisiest negativists, a man named Philip Klass, 4 anti-UFO books, challenged me on this memo. Probably you didn't notice that it was done with the large pica type. But the tradition at the White House at that time was a small elite type, and he had 9 samples to prove it. I challenge you, he said, to find any genuine memos, letters,